Fifth SONA ni Pangulong Duterte, and this year is going to be very, very different. Second to the last na ito. So the president will have to lay out ano ba talagang gusto niya maging legacy niya before he enters his twilight years in office. Not to mention, this year will be also different dahil sa social distancing measures. It's gonna be close to impossible to have the SONA the way we had in the past, kung saan halos nandyan lahat yung Philippine political establishment and foreign dignitaries sa ating Kongreso to watch the President's address live. But something else will also be different this year. Legally sanctioned protests. Ngayon, nag-release ng special advisory ang Department of Internal Local Government kung saan nire-request, from local government units na hindi mag-issue ng mga permits or ma-revoke if ever na-issuean ng permits ng mga protesters. Now, this advisory came out in July 23rd, and by July 24th, it became increasingly clear na mukhang pinagbabawalan ang mga protesta in major cities in Metro Manila. Kasama dyan is Quezon City. Mukhang Mayor Joy Belmonte has a little bit walked back on her earlier promise to allow for protests so long as yung social distancing and basic health regulations are observed. Now, this issue is extremely important because it concerns a fundamental right of a Filipino sa ilalim na ating saligang batas. Section 4 of the 1987 Constitution states, "No law shall be passed abridging the freedom of speech, of expression, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances." Kaya unsurprisingly, a lot of people were not very happy with this new advisory from the Philippine government. Kasama dyan yung mga aktivista at yung mga progressive groups sa Pilipinas who regularly do protest every year during SONA. Ngayon, kung maalala nyo, back in 2017, President Duterte himself went to the protesters after giving his SONA kung saan sinabi niya na ginagawa niyang lahat and he will deliver on his basic promises including land reform and making sure that any kind of martial law in Mindanao will not be abused. But the government insists that kailangan na pagbawalan mga protesta because we have to ensure social distancing at to avoid the further worsening of the COVID-19 outbreak in the Philippines, which is considered among the worst, if not the worst, in the Southeast Asian region. Keep in mind, over the past few months, may mga large-scale protests and unfortunately even riots across the United States in response to the killing of George Floyd. Now, these protests across 2,000 cities across the United States should have given us some idea kung talagang delikado magprotesta. Is it really going to contribute to the worsening of the epidemic outbreak? Ayon sa mga eksperto, not necessarily. In fact, the reverse could be true. For instance, a study released by the National Bureau of Economic Research in the United States found no evidence that urban protests reignited COVID-19 case growth during the more than 3 weeks following protest onset. So in a strange way, actually, the protests contributed to greater observation of social distancing. Now, science also shows that in open air or open space, mas safe actually ang sitwasyon dahil the aerosolized version of the virus is going to be spread so thin that its impact it's going to be very limited. In short, posible na hindi umabot yung virus, assuming one of the protesters is infected, to the threshold of transmissibility. Now, if you look at it, a lot of protesters had enough distance from each other, and a lot of them also still had masks even under duress, and while there were tear gas and all sorts of different violence going around them. In fact, according to Davil Dave of Bentley University, in many cities, the protesters actually seem to lead to a net increase in social distancing as more people who did not protest decided to stay off the streets. So ano ba talaga nangyari dito? Some suspect na baka may ulterior motive ang Duterte administration for banning protests. In a statement, ito yung sinabi ng Bayan Muna Secretary General Renato Reyes. The ITF guidelines are not law. It is not higher than the Constitution and should not be weaponized to trample on the basic, fundamental rights of our citizens. Nobody should be arrested for the peaceful exercise of one's constitutional rights. Now, many other progressive and activist groups actually also supported this kind of statement and position. So is this a question of public health policy on the part of the Duterte administration? Or is this what critics fear is nothing but a medical coup? So whether in Thailand, in the US, and many countries around the world, the accusation is that governments are using the COVID-19 emergency for actually muzzling the opposition or consolidating power. So is this what's happening in the case of the Philippines? Well, over the past 4 months, we saw a blitzkrieg of subpoenas against netizens expressing critical views and being accused of spreading misinformation. We saw the shuttering of among the country's biggest network and a controversial conviction of a leading journalist in the country. And of course, the anti-terror bill, which was passed despite a lot of criticism and called for further deliberation and consultation. So some are asking, is the government really concerned about public health policy? Because science shows that there's no strong correlation between public protest in open space and the increase in COVID-19 cases. Or is this a case of a medical coup and the government engaging in a kind of an authoritarian blitzkrieg? Ako po si Richard Hidarian. Stand with us, stand for truth.